All right.
This meeting is being recorded.
All right. Well, I'm pleased to be joined by John Dillery, recently retired from Metro Transit, I understand. And John was a senior planner there with Metro Transit. And John, thank you for taking some time to chat. How are you doing and how's retirement so far?
Well, it's I'm trying not to change too much of my daily routine. I've read someplace it's wise not to, you know, drastically change anything like your sleep hours or what you do.
Mhm.
And so far, that's what I've been doing. With the remote commuting, the telecommuting that we
Mhm.
were allowed to do, I was doing it for 2 days a week normally. But with all the flexibility that we've had for years and years anyway, and then the flexibility about what days I can telecommute, it seems odd. It's not as drastic a transition, I think, than the traditional Monday through Friday. You come into the office every day kind of commuting and work situation. So I
Mhm.
think it kind of softens the transition a little to be in the telecommute mode
Mhm.
somewhat. But yeah, so far so good. I've got other interests I'm trying to think about at least. The other thing I've read some places, and people have told me who've retired recently, give yourself time. It's not unusual for a couple of months to pass before you decide to what are some new interests I really want to engage in. And
Mhm.
I'm not in a hurry. So,
So you
but
just
there are things on my mind. So there are things I'm thinking about a lot already. Have been for a long time.
okay. Okay. So how long were you at Metro Transit and when was your last day?
I started in August, or excuse me, April 27th, 1978.
Hmm.
Worked there until December 9th, last Friday. So it's
Wow.
44 years and 8 months and some change.
So this retirement thing is really new to you, just last Friday. So congrats on that. Just looking back, I was looking at your bio from Metro Transit that they sent out. I guess
Hmm.
just to start at the beginning, it looks like you grew up in Mahtomedi, is it? And
Yeah.
had kind of a fascination with streetcars. Can you tell that story? And is that sort of
Sure.
what piqued your interest in transit?
Mhm. Yeah, no, in a way it did, yes. Mahtomedi is a East Shore community of White Bear Lake. It's an old resort town. It started before it was ever incorporated in the 1930s. It was pretty well populated in the summer months with summer cottagers. And my dad's family had gone back to 1910 or roughly when they had my father's grandfather had bought some property because it was cheap in the early 20th century and as an investment, I guess, and on the East Shore. And he had the story is the family camped out in the summer, like you would up in a state park or something, and on the East Shore on the property. And then they built a cottage. And my I remember it well. My grandparents lived there. I remember my grandmother very well lived there, and we, with my mother's help, we inherited it. So I stayed there. My wife and I lived there for a while. And we heard about streetcars growing up because it was actually an interurban, a suburban extension, fairly high speed operation extension of Twin City lines, Randolph Hazel Park line, North St. Paul, and it went past North St. Paul on private right of way and got up to speeds. Well, the streetcars didn't have speedometers, and that fascinated me too. And rocketed along pretty well. And my father's sister, my aunt, she remembers riding. She remembered and told me stories about how the streetcar swayed. But better than that, you could still walk the right of way where the tracks were. The track wasn't
Mm.
it just a block from where I grew up in the woods. We called it the streetcar, the trolley path, the streetcar path, and it's still there. And you can still walk a lot of it. And I would find bits and pieces, of old hardware and the old ties and things, and it really kind of evocative, huh? Makes you wonder what
Yeah.
was this. So they told me all about it. My dad drew me a floor plan of the traditional standard streetcar and showed me where stuff was. And I said, wow, this is really interesting. So I always had it in my mind, you know. I tried to build my own little homemade railroad out of scrap lumber in the backyard when I was a
Mhm.
boy. So I guess that's
Mhm.
a fixation. Then started getting more and more interested, and then went to high school out there in Mahtomedi, and then
Mhm.
cast about. I thought I'd be an architect or engineer.
Mhm.
Pre-computer, I really had trouble trying to hack calculus, so I kind of gave up, ran into a wall, and they said, now what am I going to be? And I said, well, geography and maps really fascinate me. So I'll see, there's a geography major you can have. So I went into that, wound up at that at the University of Minnesota. And when I was at the University of Minnesota, I learned about the Streetcar Museum.
Hmm.
Minnesota Transportation Museum was called then, still today's Minnesota Streetcar Museum.
Hmm.
And I went out there, and lo and behold, here was a full-size Survivor, a streetcar, very much like what used to run out there in my hometown. And, oh my
Hmm.
gosh, to be able to get in it and ride it. So I volunteered and got to be an operator.
Hmm.
And one of the people operating with me on and off was working for in the executive branch of the Metropolitan Transit Commission, and named
Mhm.
Bill. And he said, well, you're so fascinated with transportation, you know, you could maybe look at getting a job with MTC, which of course became Metro Transit later. And I said, well, okay. This should have been a warning to me. There was economic budget problems in about 1977, and
Mhm.
they weren't hiring anybody. Opposite problem of today. I
Mhm.
couldn't get a job as a driver. I thought I'd start as a driver and see, you know, work my way
Yeah.
up, which is off in the path, a really interesting, unique way nowadays to do things. You can still get ahead starting as a driver in the transit business. I said, well, now what am I going to do? So I talked to Bill, and he said, don't give up, John. I just heard they're going to hire interns again this year. And you're at the University of Minnesota, right? So yeah. So why don't you go apply as an intern? So I did,
Mhm.
and I just never left.
Hmm.
I was interviewed by some of the old time guys who had been working at Twin City Lines and then MTC, and these guys went back to the late 1930s,
Wow.
real old veterans. So it was
Yeah.
a bridge between old style transit management practices and then the modern day. So I've seen a
Yeah.
lot of changes. That's how I got started.
Wow. 44 years. That's quite a run. You don't see that very often anymore, staying in one place.
In the transit business, it seems to be a saying, and people agree with me, this tends to be true. It's maybe like a lot of logistical businesses like railroads and transit,
Mm-hmm.
similar. You're either a short timer
Mm-hmm.
and you're drift off, or you're a lifer, and
Mm-hmm.
there's not much
Mm-hmm.
in between. So I worked with a couple of guys, until I retired. I was working with a couple of guys who actually were a year or so or three up on me. And
Wow.
together we had something like a century and a half of combined experience.
Wow. That's crazy.
So it's
Yeah.
it's it's transit business, and I've talked to other people in transit business over the years at conferences and such. And actually, the phenomenon is fairly universal.
I had an uncle who worked for the railroad for many years. And I remember
Right.
he died a long time ago, but he had they gave him a plaque or something upon
Sure.
his retirement. And it said, there was a little saying, it said, they won't let me drive the train or even ring the bell, but if this train should jump the tracks, then see who catches hell. I always remember that. But anyway, it sounds like it must have been a fulfilling career for you. Can you, just reflecting back, talk a little bit
Yeah.
about some of the major projects or initiatives you worked on?
Once the planning department became rebuilt or reconfigured in about early 1980s, and they figured out what to do with us planners and analysts and such. And the reason I'm saying that is transit business was hit so hard by declines in the 50s, 60s, and started turning around in the 70s when we went to public ownership and there was new money to invest in doing things. They had downsized drastically so much, Twin City Lines had, that they didn't have a planning department anymore. They didn't have any, they basically were more in a reactive mode all the time. The schedulers, the guys who wrote the schedules, and I mean literally wrote them by hand. I still remember the big sheets of green line paper, and kind of like the railroads. I mean, computerization was resisted by the old school. They had clerk typists to type up special schedules on big, broad carriage typewriters. Anyway, we didn't even have planning as a notion, so they didn't know what to do with us. So at first we did all sorts of other duties as assigned, which today are done by people who put the signs in the shelters and people that respond to customer relations. So it's kind of boot camp. But once they figured out what to do, we started to work on some really interesting projects. Metro Council, I have to deal with this hard truth. Metro Council was in a very reactionary mode in the 1970s into the 80s, where the people running the outfit and especially the staff didn't even want to talk about anything on rails. It had to be buses, and they didn't even, honestly, to really call their bluff back in the day, they didn't even get interested in bus lanes and things. The Nickel Mall was a bus lane because the city of Minneapolis got more support from the federal government and to get the project going by saying it would be transit and pedestrian. That's a historic fact. So we, it wasn't because Twin City Lines and Metro Transit Commission were pushing that hard. I mean, they wanted it, sure, but it wasn't like they weren't on the vanguard of it. They more or less come along with the ride, and that's great. And Marquette second bus lanes and other lanes that came along too, but they wouldn't talk about rail. Once in a while they would, but normally they wouldn't. Now, the county commissioners, at Hennepin County especially, some key ones, John Darris was a key man. He may have heard the name, got so frustrated with his reactionary position on the part of Met Council that they said, well, heck with it. We'll just form our own county rail authority, at least temporarily, or something to get this thing going, because we really want to study light rail transit. They're doing in San Diego on old railroad right of way. We've got some opportunities here. We're nuts not to do it. So long story short, we have regional rail authorities, in fact, because the Metro Council didn't want to play ball. And that taught me a hard lesson. It said, boy, if you're dealing with people that just react and don't think ahead, you're going to wind up splintering off, and you're going to, it's going to be very hard to coalesce and have true good regional planning, And so the lesson to me was learn, and it's not easy for me always. Listen, write down what they're saying, say that, So one of the first projects myself and some of my colleagues worked on in 1981, and I found the papers just when I was cleaning up my office, was connecting bus service around the Southwest Light Rail Line, and indeed about 5 different light rail lines recommended by the people at Hennepin County, and then Ramsey County came along. So I did connecting bus service planning in a very schematic and manual way, starting in 1981.
Wow.
And that was my first big project. So we got all charged up about it. And then the leadership was just so uncertain that these things just went fallow. So pure, systems, other metro areas around the United States were moving ahead with saying, let's build something and try it. We don't have to do everything, but let's try something. And in the meantime, the Twin Cities is just, not doing anything.
Yeah.
And so, but we did all these studies, and we designed routes. That's basically what I've done most of my career. Designed bus routes that were the efficient lengths so that a bus could make a round trip and cycle with recovery time, and the driver could, schedules an efficient way, and it feeds certain local areas around the rail lines coming in at stations. And we told the people designing the rail line, here's how much space you need for buses at these stations. Here's what's going to come here. And of course, there were people at Hennepin County and this became a theme, sadly, who didn't have realistic ideas about what you could do. And so we had fellows who were insisting, at the county especially, that you must design your bus service so that you're not spending any money on new bus service at all. You just have to break even. Whatever you spend on the rail service, you got to save on the bus side. And you can interview people all over the world who've done this kind of design work, planning work, and they'll say, no, that's not a realistic idea. Although sometimes we were lucky enough, we could do like with the Green Line between St. Paul and Minneapolis, which we did a preliminary plan for. We found out that we were very lucky. There was a lot of bus savings we could put in the bank, and we could do a lot of service improvements. But you got to be realistic. So the next thing I moved on to when that 1980s rail planning went fallow was to get into what we started to call sector studies, which started in a small way in about 1990. And we were getting some new management at the time that were more forward-looking, and they were actually Metro Transit Commission, basically people, because the Metropolitan Transit Commission finally decided that hiring a contract management firm, which was based out of Cincinnati, Ohio, a for-profit management firm, it just wasn't really proving to be a good thing. So I think it was a very encouraging part of changes that happened in about the 80s, that late 80s, and said, now you can start to plan because we're really going to start looking ahead. There were some big movements to put in new express bus service in the 70s. A lot of the freeway expresses started then in the 70s, 80s, but they put them in so fast that they didn't really take a holistic look at all the local service that was working in the same corridors, which isn't what you do, because you wind up duplicating things and not coordinating things very well. So here I was, I said, hey, let's try to coordinate. So I got an education in that time in my career. Let's be really thinking hard about the network, everything working together. You would think it might almost sound obvious to you. Well, sure, it's not just a bus line, it's a member of a whole family of routes, and they have to work together. And by the way, everybody knows the Twin Cities metro area has got multi-nodes, or sprawl, whatever you want to say. There's lots of places to go.
What is a node?
A node is, a place where people want to go is a node. It can be shopping, it could be work, it could be school. And you've got to have people connecting. Well, this was a new notion. And not everywhere around the world, but around here.
Right.
So I focused, a big project of mine was learning more about how you can make transfers work well. And we want to talk to experts in what's called time transfer. Basically routes line up at the same time. The operators see each other ideally. They hold for a moment. You're allowed to really be sure and as guaranteed as you possibly can be, especially in the winter, that you can get places. Now all of a sudden, it's the old thing about, well, all the transit routes go downtown. What if I don't want to go downtown? Well, of course, that's a gross oversimplification. But we took it to heart. And next big project I had in the late 1990s was, and it kind of came out of making a network that makes sense. Said, well, it seems like a small thing, but it really got to be a problem. We didn't have a sensible route numbering system. We had two Route 5s, one in St. Paul, one in Minneapolis. They're nothing like each other. We had two Route 4s. We had two Route 14s. We had, and I said, wait a minute. So I was put in charge. This was like the first project I was really put in charge of, and saying, John, you figure it out, planner. What's best practices? So I made some calls, pre-internet pretty much, right?
Right.
And got some contacts. And there were a couple of different ways to do route numbering. And so I basically redesigned the regional route numbering system, which is pretty much intact now. Some of the management got new ideas about what to call a light rail line. They were going to be in the 50 series originally. And they were. The Hiawatha line was the 55, Highway 55.
Exactly. Right.
And then the management said, I like colors. Let's call it the blue line. I said, whatever.
Sure.
A good system that you design is flexible. A good scheme can be modified and still make sense, right?
Right.
So
Right.
that's what I did. So I'm really proud of regional route numbering. And to this day,
Yeah.
I'll have people that have to remember what route is where will thank
Yeah.
me and say, "Oh yeah, all the 200 series are north and east of St. Paul, and all the 300s are east of St.
Yeah.
Paul, like Woodbury and all of etc." And that was my. And then after that, we got into sector by sector studies, and
Mm.
finally we started to get serious about something other than buses, and we had our first light rail line 2004, and I was very much involved in that.
Yeah, I was there when they broke ground on that project. Then Governor Jesse Ventura was there, and I remember talking to him. He was a pretty big proponent of that, what they called the Hiawatha rail line at the time.
Yeah,
And but that was
you're right. And we probably wouldn't have it if it weren't for Jesse Ventura.
yeah.
Probably.
One thing we hear a lot about now is not just the transit lines themselves, but how they can be attract development of apartments and other things of that nature.
Mhm.
Was that something that was on their radar back in the early 80s or late 70s when you started out? Did they even think in those terms that this could be a springboard for more development?
You didn't hear that message, which is a truth. Um, consistently or clearly. And in hindsight, it's quite astonishing to me that that connection wasn't promoted more.
Mm-hmm.
In the Metro Council's pro-bus Uber alles era back there in the early 80s, they basically said, well, just fund us well enough and we will be able to do wonderful things, and trust us. And here's a big lesson I learned. And I made this note in my little retirement speech I made.
Mm-hmm.
There wasn't this understanding, but to me, it's as clear as the nose on my face when I look in the mirror. Providing a good transit network anywhere is only 50% the responsibility of the people operating the transit system. It's about community, right? You cannot do it all by yourself. 50% of the responsibility, and I think this message needs to be shouted from the rooftops a lot more. 50% of the responsibility for providing an effective, good transit network, a realistic one, that'll meet the needs, and especially equitable. We hear that word a lot today, don't we? Providing the service, most service to the people that need it most.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. 50% of that responsibility is the communities. Community is neighborhoods. You grow up in the neighborhood appreciating the transit system and valuing it. You wouldn't think to vandalize it, or you wouldn't think to punch a driver or do anything like that, because you're just wrecking your own life. You see the big picture. You understand the community. Your aunt, your uncle, your mom, your dad, your brother, you ride, benefit from the service. You value the service. The cities have to support transit system, and it's everything from always including where transit routes need to run to be most efficient, do the job the best, most cost effective, by providing the right transit paths, street, be good about transit lanes, priorities, work with the businesses to say, look, I know you want curb parking here, but the greater good is we really need a bus stop here.
Mm-hmm.
We'll put parking around the corner, simple things like that. That's community supporting transit. That's giving good soil so the garden will grow.
Mm-hmm.
The transit system is the planters putting the vegetables in. The community is providing the good soil and water and everything to support it. You've got to have the cities think carefully about when they tear up streets to rebuild them, to try to do it as quickly and efficiently as they can, and also to try to minimize the severe impacts that can occur on the transit lines, to make sure that they don't get so slow or inconvenient or worse, unreliable because of your construction project. You'd think it would be a given My experience over 44 years plus is that it is not a given.
Hmm.
And we have to keep reminding ourselves of this. The state, the counties have to do the same thing as the cities. In most metro areas, you go around the country and the world, the county level of government does basically all the heavy lifting about funding transit, the operations, and everything. We don't do that here.
Mhm.
We keep going to the state legislature and say the state legislature is going to solve all our problems. And you probably know this, that is not the normal governmental structure in most of our states around the United States of America. Most places, the state will set the policies and say, now here's what you are going to do, metro area counties. You are going to work with this metro council, your regional government. You're going to be working it out in a way that you all feel things are credibly done. There's accountability, that you are levying your taxes to pay for your transit system.
The role of government.
You're gonna do it. Your job. Now the state's role, of course, is to facilitate that and not to micromanage. So you don't have the legislature telling you, well, you can't do planning for a rail line here because my constituents don't like it. Most places in the United States, that's unheard of, but it's our history. So, state responsibility is part of the community. Then the federal government's part of the community to make sure that state and multi-state transit, Amtrak, regional services all knit together. You see, it's one big network that goes on and on if we look at it that way. So my lesson is be careful that you're looking at the project of providing good public transportation realistically. 50% of the job is the transit providers to work and to provide good, reliable service you can count on that's stable. 50% of the job is the community to support it.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, everybody has to have a stake in it. So,
right. Yeah, everyone has to have a stake and everyone has to be accountable.
Yeah. So what,
I think we can.
we talked a little bit before we, just when we started, but do you have any big plans now for retirement? Are you going to go travel the world and travel the light rail systems around Europe? And
there's a lot of, that's right, Brian. There's a lot of traveling I've been kind of putting off. I've got some friends, my mom's friends and their kids that live in France, and I haven't seen them for decades, and I'd like to go back and see them, visit them. I'd like to travel around the country a little bit more. There's a lot of trips I haven't taken. I love train travel, get a nice sleeper car and, food and see the country. And I've had some very enjoyable trips, not as many as I'd like. And on that subject, I would like very much to work with National Association of Railroad Passengers and its local outgrowth known as All Aboard Minnesota. And if you've heard of them, All Aboard Minnesota is a grassroots organization working hard to restore, is the right word, restore our Midwest network of passenger trains, passenger and parcel post and trains and things. And I have this vision of hub and spoke ground transportation in the United States, starting at the Midwest, and where if we could at least have 3 departures every 24 hours, about 8 hours apart, how we could get a lot of places that we really can't right now. Indeed, there are a lot of third world countries that have more complete network of ground transportation, public transportation options than we have here in Minnesota. I dare say we can do better. And I'm going to spend a lot of time, I think, in the coming years on that, working with those organizations, because I think there's been missing a vision of how the network could work and how you could actually apply it in your life. How you'd say, oh, I could take that train leaving at 8 o'clock in the morning and I could be that next big hub and I could make a connection, within 8 hours later, and I could go all these places. So that's exciting to think about. So I have some dreams.
That is exciting, and hats off to you for continuing to work in that and share your knowledge and wisdom that you've gained over all these years. And maybe we'll run into you on one of those trains or buses, in the future, and we'll be sure to say hi.
Sure, follow up and keep Yeah,
Yeah.
keep talking. I guess I'm
Yeah.
sort of a transportation addict, so.
For sure, for sure. Well, that's a good addiction, I think, to have. So, John, thank you for your time. It's been a pleasure chatting with you, and
Wow.
best wishes in your retirement, sir.
Oh, thank you, Brian Johnson. It's very, very kind of you to look me up, and appreciate the opportunity.
All right. Well, it's been fun. Have a good day, and we'll
You too.
talk
Keep the
again.
faith.
Take
Only one
care.
way up.
Right on.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.